Welcome to this edition of Go Vote Omaha, presented by the League of Women Voters of Greater Omaha. I'm Karina Hernandez, Director at Large for the League of Omaha, and your host for today's program. Today we're talking to Dr. Terri Crawford, a University of Nebraska at Omaha Community Fellow, addressing redlining through community engagement about the practice of redlining and the impacts it still has today. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan organization and does not endorse political candidates or parties. The League does, however, take positions on issues. Our purpose is to empower voters and defend democracy. Go Vote Omaha primarily focuses on policy issues, and as a result of our discussions, we hope you feel ready to make informed decisions at election time. So let's talk to Dr. Terri Crawford. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really glad to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, you're the expert. Can you talk to us? Can you start off with some of the history of redlining in Omaha?
Sure.
And the impacts it has on communities of color?
Okay. So redlining began in the 1930s as a result of an administrative act and an administrative agency. So the agency would have been the Homeowners Loan Corporation. So it was a federal agency that created a group of individuals that went out to communities across the country to make a determination as to who was worthy of services and who was not worthy of services. So imagine, if you will, that land surveyors would show up in these communities across the country. They would do a visual inspection of who lived in the neighborhoods, and at that time they would make a determination as to who would be worthy of mortgage services, who would be worthy of other financial services. So the Homeowners Loan Corporation created a system across the nation where all of these individuals simultaneously would go into the communities, and they created what we know as our redlining maps. So these were color-coded maps that actually drew lines around areas where services would not be provided. So for instance, there were 4 colors. The first color would have been the green area that were prime and perfect to receive all of those services. So that would be places like, for us, Happy Hollow and Dundee and Elmwood Park and those areas. That would have been our historically red line area, not the red line area, but the green area. Then we would have blue on our maps that were described as those land surveyors as still desirable for all of the services that were available. The next color on the maps would have been yellow. Yellow would have been indicated as still declining, and the individuals that lived in those areas would have been described as foreign-born and also an older housing stock. By the time we got to the red line areas, those were the areas that were predominantly black and brown and very ethnically diverse. So they were described on the maps as hazardous. And when we normally think about hazards, we think about environmental hazards, right? But they were described as hazardous based on the people who lived there. So as a result of these surveyors coming to these communities and color coding these lines, then it created really a snowball effect as to who would receive services and who would have the opportunities to create generational wealth. Today you can still see in not only Omaha, but in cities across the country where those same areas that were originally redlined are still the same areas that have very deep pockets of poverty.
Yeah. Well, can you speak a little bit about affordable housing and how that has been affected in Omaha?
Sure. So affordable housing is very tied to redlining. Affordable housing really depends on a definition that has been given by the federal government. That definition generally says no one person should spend more than 30% of their income on their housing. We know for those pockets of poverty that are in the red line areas, that is not realistic at all for those individuals. There are individuals who lived in the historically red line area in Omaha that spend upwards of 50% or more of their income on their housing. When we think about redlining and what affordable housing really means is that there's an opportunity to create generational wealth for you and all of your lineage. If that doesn't happen, then affordable housing just means a place to house people where you can rent or lease. That does not create generational wealth. So the fuller conversation really has to be around what affordable really means, what that means to generations to come, and for those that were excluded from those opportunities to gain generational wealth, we also have to talk about how we recreate those opportunities in those areas where disinvestment occurred.
Do you want to talk a little bit about how we do recreate those opportunities now?
Sure. So let's talk first about what that looked like in Omaha, Nebraska for our originally red line area.
Okay.
So think about Cumming Street northward to Sprague Street. It was a very small area, and that was our originally a red line map. So it would have been Cumming Street to Sprague, and then 38th Street eastward to the river. It was a very small area, but of course it did expand over time. So if you think about exactly what that did to a community, we went northward instead of westward from Cumming Street, because if you think about what's there, there's a conglomerate right there on 24th that would be Creighton University. So Creighton would not have been drawn into the red line area. If we go up to 38th Street and move eastward to the river, then we have to think about who else would have been drawn outside of the red line. We have Cathedral, we have Jocelyn's museum there, we have the Mercer Mansion. So all of those would have also been outside of the red line area. So it would have included areas from 38th Street and most of what would have been North Omaha in the 1930s, and it expanded over time there. So what that did is continues to have an impact on, again, those pockets of poverty that I talked about. So if you juxtapose the map today from, say, 2020 census, which is some of the work that we've been doing on the redlining project, you take that map and juxtapose it over that 1930s map, and there are things like life expectancy in the red line area. The life expectancy is 11.5 years less, depending on your zip code. That all can be tied to redlining and some of the actual environmental hazards and other things that occurred in those areas, such as disinvestment. There was capital flight, there was white flight. So when all of that capital left and moved westward, none of it ever really returned to North Omaha. I remember a time, because I was very young at that time, that we had a Wonder Bread, and there was a Pepsi plant, a Coca-Cola plant. We had a Peter Pan. So there was lots of industry on North 30th Street, North 24th Street, and North 16th Street. All of that fed those residents that lived in North Omaha. When all of that industry fled as a result of redlining and white flight, none of those jobs stayed or returned to North Omaha. So it, of course, created a vacuum of what used to be a very thriving economic place. As a result of that, the affordable housing definition changed, and also upward mobility and the economic base for that area completely changed.
So let's take a step back. Can you tell me a little bit about what the Redlining Project is?
Sure. So addressing redlining through service learning and community engagement is a project that I am leading at the University of Nebraska at Omaha. So I stepped into that role in November, a year ago, November. That role was created as a result of the strategic initiative of the University of Nebraska at Omaha, wanting to be more intentional about addressing race, social justice, poverty, and also inequity in the community that we serve. University of Nebraska of Omaha is a metropolitan urban university, so naturally there should be a bridge to the community that we serve. So the strategic initiative, as a result of those four things I just talked about, developed this project, and we have what we call our sister project, the spatial justice part of it, and then the redlining part of it. The redlining part is the project that I am leading. The spatial justice is the project that addresses the racial covenants on deeds. For instance, in our red line area that we just talked about, there were restrictive covenants on many of the deeds on many of the properties in Omaha, Nebraska, that specifically said that only people of the white race would be able to live in specific divisions or specific cul-de-sacs or specific zip codes. All of those continue to exist on deeds today as we speak. Although it is an illegal practice right now, it still exists on those deeds. So when this project came into being, we had all of those things in mind as to what we do to help address the impact of redlining. Along the way, we never knew that we were going to come into possession of Undesign the Red Line, which is the exhibit that was housed down at the Union for Contemporary Arts. I believe they had it for 4 years, and then they had it throughout COVID. As a result of their contract coming to an end, we came into possession of it at University of Nebraska at Omaha. It is an awesome exhibit. If the viewers have not had an opportunity to see it, we want everyone to get out to the university to have an opportunity to see the exhibit. So it talks about the history of Holick and some of the land surveyors, exactly how all of that happened in Omaha, Nebraska, but it also gives the historical context as to how it happened across the nation. So we have tours for the exhibit on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. And you can go to the website at the university to schedule those. But on Thursday, it's kind of an open room, if you will. Anyone can come into the exhibit area and just kind of walk around and read the panels. There are a total of 5 to just kind of explore. And it is also interactive, so you have an opportunity to leave a note, or you can pinpoint where you live or where someone you know lives in a redlined area to make a determination as to whether or not you have ever been redlined yourself or anyone you know, or if you lived in a redline area and have since had the opportunity to move out. So we are very happy with some of the things that are happening with the exhibit.
Wow, that's incredible. And how long is it? Just like, do you have a timeline for?
We do.
Yeah.
So we did our launch in November of last year. That included donors, it included faculty partners, it included community partners, just a conglomerate of everyone that we wanted to come do the launch. We had kind of a community talk back, and then we started our tours. So it's going to be on campus for a total of 2 years.
Okay.
We're not sure what will happen with it after that. We are hoping that it stays in Omaha because it is very localized and there's some things that are very specific to Omaha, Lincoln, and Council Bluffs in the exhibit. So we hope to have everyone come through within that 2-year period, and then we'll see what happens with it after that.
Wow, that's incredible. I want to go myself, actually. Maybe I'll stop by on a Thursday.
You should absolutely
get a tour.
Come up, yes, and we can do a tour for the league as well.
Yeah, we
can
should.
do that.
We should. So I'm going to get back to my questions.
Okay.
How have lending practices and access to credit in Omaha been impacted by redlining?
Okay. So one of the things that happened during the 1930s is there was a specific process and a practice that disallowed credit to individuals in those red line areas. So here's the snowball effect of all of that is those that were in the A areas that I described, they were in a place where they had the opportunity to create generational wealth far and above those that lived in red line areas. So credit worthiness really was not a major factor. What was a major factor was your race and your ethnicity and the neighborhood or the zip code that you lived in. So what that did is disallow those individuals to create generational wealth then in the 1930s, and it continues to have an impact now in 2023 and really years into the future until we can decide what a more full impact of kind of dismantling what redlining did in communities across the country. And we can have some conversations about that also, because on the exhibit, panel 5 talks about what we can do to reframe, redesign, and reinvest in those areas.
Yeah. Do you want to talk a little bit
Sure.
about panel 5 then?
Sure. So panel 5, after we go through each one of the panels, panel 1 then gives the start of redlining and then also the organization that created the exhibits. And I also want to make sure that I always give a shout out to Designing the We, which is a corporation out of New York that created these exhibits for many cities across the country. So shout out to them. We work around the room to each one of the panels and a historical perspective, and then by the time we get to panel 5, after we've talked about all of these detrimental things that have happened in these communities, then we talk about what we can do collectively to have an impact on what has happened due to redlining in these neighborhoods. So panel 5 has 3 specific areas. First, we talk about reframing the language. One of the things I talk to people about whenever they come into the exhibit, show of hands, how many of you knew about redlining? Not many people do. Show of hands, how many of you know that you are a benefactor of exactly the process that was created for you as a benefit for redlining? Not many people will raise their hands. So we talk about that and how we have to reframe the language because it's part of an absent narrative in curriculum everywhere as to what redlining does to these communities. And then the bottom portion on each one of those panels will also allow you an opportunity to say for yourself how I can, through my organization or through my networks, do something else to impact redlining. So the first part is reframing the language. The second part then is redesigning how we have these conversations. So when we think about how redlining was created across the country, there were what I like to call a cast of characters that were involved. It included the federal, the state, and the local government. It included local agencies such as city planning and urban development and other organizations, the real estate industry, appraisers. All of those were the cast of characters that allowed something like redlining to thrive, right? So as we're talking about redesigning, we want to bring all of those individuals back into the fold and redesign exactly how all of that happened. So let's have a conversation about healing these communities and the harm that was caused. And then the last part of it is how do we reinvest in those communities? When we think about reinvestment, generally we think about putting your money where your mouth is, right? But reinvestment is going to require much more than just philanthropic dollars. It's going to require reinvestment of your time and your talent and actually involving organizations that will come into the communities, have the conversations. One of the things I was charged with when I stepped into the role as the community fellow is to build a board based on an asset-based framework. So we wanted to make sure that we tapped in individuals that lived and worked in, played in, and had more than just a passing existence in the impacted area. And those are the people we want to bring to the table. So you can tell us what you see as a project or an initiative that we can create in the neighborhood. So all of that is going to be part of the reinvesting and the redesigning. So there's an opportunity for individuals to have those conversations collectively. You can have it individually. You can bring your network out, and then we can brainstorm as to how all of that happens. The other piece of it in my role as the community fellow is we are also having these conversations with faculty partners where we will partner with the school and then a community partner to come up with the project as to how it's done. So there's several ways that we can do it as long as we continue to have the conversation.
Right, and that was actually one of my questions. What community groups or advocacy groups have been working around redlining as well, and have you seen any impact from that or collaboration?
I am working with several groups. One in particular is the Divisible Project. Divisible is a film that is being created about redlining in Omaha, Nebraska. The filmmaker, her name is Lizzie Barrett. She's been to Omaha several times. I believe Lizzie is out of New York. So that film is being made where we talk to those people that live and work and play in that I just described so that we can get the lived experiences of those individuals to tell our story nationally. That film is going to be released during Native Omaha Days, and it will be at the Benson Theater. So that's one, would be through the Divisible Project. We are also having conversations with other organizations such as Spark. We have had conversations with Front Porch. We also have One Omaha who's involved in the training with our community board. So there are several organizations throughout the community, and as the word spreads, then more come into the fold.
Right.
So it's spreading like wildfire,
Yeah.
and we're very happy that it's having this impact and these conversations are taking place.
Well, I'm so glad that it seems like everybody's like all hands on deck on this. So we're getting to the end of our time here, but I did want to talk to you. Last question. Can you talk about any recent policy changes or initiatives aimed at addressing redlining in Omaha?
Absolutely. So one of the things I always talk about first before we get to Omaha policy is there is a blueprint that exists as to how this can happen in a city. I always talk about Evanston, Illinois. Evanston, Illinois has done something really remarkable, but for them, they passed a legalization of marijuana in their city. And what they did with the funds that are generated is to create a revenue fund. That revenue fund goes into, we'll call it a pot, right? That pot is called the reparation fund. That reparation fund is used to fund individuals who have been historically redlined. So we'll do things like pay for down payment for housing. It will help with credit repairs so that you can qualify for a mortgage. It will do things like modifications in homes. So we're looking at doing something like that in Omaha, Nebraska, through having other conversations. And I can say Front Porch is one of those organizations that is doing something similar as far as down payments and repairing credit and providing an opportunity for people to have access to a mortgage to actually purchase a home. Policy changes, we're still working on that in our legislature, so we'll see how that plays out for us.
Wow. And how can individuals get involved in this? I know we can go see the exhibit.
Yeah. So individuals should go to our website at University of Nebraska at Omaha, Service Learning Academy. There is a QR code there. Once you do the QR code, then it will take you to a jot form that will allow you to schedule a tour. Our tours are on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, and we schedule tours as late as 6 o'clock. So we've had all types of individuals come in to have the tour. That's one way that you can schedule them, and then of course the Thursday you can come up anytime. There are also opportunities to have engaged community conversations around redlining. I've done the Douglas County Historical Society, several other organizations. So there's an opportunity for us to have larger conversations, and it continues throughout Omaha and also across the country.
And what do you hope is the biggest takeaway that you hope that viewers will take out of this conversation around redlining?
Okay. My biggest hope is, number one, we recognize redlining for what it was. It was a very racist policy that relegated people to certain sections of cities across the country, and it was done simultaneously. Once we recognize that, then there are things we can do to address the harm that was historically caused. And then once we acknowledge that we want to address that harm, then there are things that we can do collectively as individuals and again as organizations to have the conversation and then show up for that reinvesting part of it in all of these communities, particularly in Omaha, Nebraska, as lots of things are happening.
Yeah, I feel like it's been a really big issue in Omaha. So yeah, so I'm glad that, you know, there's groups like yours, you know, who are really focused on these issues. I feel like I have time for one more question.
Okay.
And while I have you, I have to ask you. So how has redlining intersected with other forms of systemic inequality in Omaha, such as education and employment?
Thank you so much for that question. So another part of the conversation that we have during the exhibit and also during other discussions in the community is how redlining is multidisciplinary. So it touches and concerns every single discipline on our campus, and it also touches and concerns every single discipline in those that have been impacted. There are educational outcomes that are different in red line areas than they are in areas outside of the red line areas. There are different social determinants of health outcomes in the red line areas. For instance, there are very high incidences of asthma for children in grade school in the red line areas. That has to do with not only the red line area itself, but also environmental hazards that exist in that area, particularly lead in the area. There was a time when we were determined to be a super site, and there had to be cleanup and remediation of the soil in north and northeast Omaha. So naturally, there's going to be some different health outcomes. Upward mobility, educational outcome, social determinants of health, all of those are impacted differently in the red line area. as compared to those areas outside of the red line area. So it's a full conversation that we should be having. Every single governmental agency, every citizen, every network, every organization should be having this conversation, and then come into the fold so we can talk about that reinvesting part.
Right. Do you find that people are surprised by some of those numbers?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
People were very surprised by some of the numbers because, of course, if you're not impacted by it, then you don't think about it. If it impacts your life on a daily basis, however, you think about it constantly. So we need to bring both of those demographics together to have the conversation and talk about solutions.
Yeah. Do you have any advice for anyone who's who wants to have those conversations but is kind of afraid of the difficulties that it might have?
It is a difficult conversation, and we always start there. If you are uncomfortable by this conversation, then that means I've done my job, because the goal is for us to get uncomfortable being uncomfortable, because this is a necessary conversation. I think during the fiasco and the egregious thing that happened to George Floyd, it opened up an opportunity for us to have these conversations in an open, candid, honest way, not just across the country, but across the globe. As a result of that, then there's been lots of interest in redlining conversations and other race-based conversations that we were afraid to have, and now we are able to have those conversations. So I think we're in a good place to do that, and then also do something to impact what has happened with redlining in communities, particularly in Omaha, but across the country as well.
Right, and it seems that, even just starting with going to the exhibit, taking the time to read through the panels, educating yourself on redlining, because I think that that's that might be the part that kind of scares people, is that they don't feel educated enough to start those conversations. So make sure to go check out the exhibit. We're getting close to our time now, so I just want to say thank you so much to Dr. Terri Crawford for taking your time to be here with us. We might have to do a part 2 because this is such an important conversation.
Wonderful.
And thank you to all of you for tuning in for the League of Women Voters of Greater Omaha. I'm Karina Hernandez, reminding you to inform yourself about issues and candidates, and when it's election time, be ready to go vote Omaha.